no secret that Blood Angels are one of my favorite Space Marine chapters. And it's also no secret that I'm not really happy about the design direction that Games Workshop is taking with some of them. Flaps. When the new Sanguinor was revealed, I wasn't quite feeling it. And don't get me wrong, I think there's way worse models out there, but it just doesn't excite me, as it's basically the old model with a digital design era facelift. Although that face looks the opposite of lift. I get that this pose is supposed to look like he's appearing out of nowhere in a bright flash of light, like a savior turning the tide of the battle, but the pose is just too static for me. The armor design is not too terrible, but I want my Sanguinor to fit my Sanguinary Guard with a design that is more ancient and gothic looking. Also, how they made him float is just terrible to me. Like, dude, you got toilet paper stuck in your pants. And I'm just not a fan of these wings. Imagine having to walk through a door like that. What I would prefer is a wing design that looks like it's retractable and maybe even has some kind of practical use instead. Luckily, Games Workshop decided to give us some awesome Space Marines in Age of Sigma, so I'm gonna bash together all of these parts and see what sticks. Well, except that one. Once I started to assemble the major parts, I couldn't help but realize that there's at least 4 different ways to build this that would look absolutely amazing, and I needed some visual representation of these possible results to help decide which way I wanted to go. So I took pictures of the box arts and cut them apart in Photoshop so I could freely rearrange them and try out all of these options without ruining the miniatures. I was pretty sure I would use the Sanguinor's legs, the sword, shoulders, chalice and head so that he could still easily be identified on first sight. And I would be using the chest and arms as well as the wings from the Knight Azeroths. I think the combination of the more gothic chest armor and the sculpted abs and the Blood Angel symbol on the belt under the hip guard would be combining the best both of these models had to offer. I slapped everything together and posted a first draft to my Discord for some feedback. However, I also wanted to see how the conversion would look like with the cloth. And I'm not going to lie, I think this looks pretty amazing, especially if I think about all the potential freehands I could slap on there. But maybe it's a tiny bit too much. I kinda hate that there's so many combinations that would look really cool. And like I said, I really would like to build all of them, but I only have one of each, so a decision had to be made. Just to get the finished picture, I also added the Iron Halo and checked my options for the Chalice. And I'm still torn whether to retain the Lantern version or if he should lift it the traditional way. I guess we'll find out at the end of the video. Like you saw in the mock-up, I got rid of the energy part of the wings because I was afraid it would be a little overkill, and I already did a version where I kept that part for my Sanguinary Guard. That turned out to be quite the cleanup, but I think ultimately it was worth it. I also got rid of the comet tails on the wings, carefully cutting and scraping not to damage the feathers, and then I used sandpaper to smooth everything out again, which took me another 2 hours. Of course, I did all of that sitting down, and if you're anything like me, you're spending way too much time that way every day. That's why I got a standing desk that allows me to sit comfortably and relax my back while nerding out, or even work standing up if I want to. Additionally, I finally threw out my gaming chair that never offered any healthy support anyway and upgraded to a proper ergonomic chair. That's the sound of my back celebrating. This is the FlexiSpot C7 and it's super comfortable. This mesh design allows for proper ventilation, so no more sweating into fake leather during hot days. Every single part of this chair is adjustable, obviously height, but also the seat angle and depth, the armrests. For example, when I'm painting or converting, I can push them all the way up and rest my elbows comfortably while leaning back without straining my back muscles. You can adjust the lumbar support to your needs and individual body composure, and the same goes for the headrest. When I'm replying to emails or when I'm editing my videos, I can just sit back in a relaxed way and the C7 is taking care of everything. And when you want to chill out and do some breathing, then the back support reclines up to 128 degrees into the super comfortable lounge mode. My cats love it too, and even though they love it so much, there still is no visible wear and tear. If you're unsure about the quality, FlexiSpot offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, as well as extended warranty up to 10 years on some of these parts. So make sure to head over to the FlexiSpot website using my link in the description and check out their Christmas holiday sale to grab some massive discount, not only on the C7 cabin chair, but also on their standing desks and other accessories. And you can use my discount code displayed here on screen during checkout to save even more on your order. Doing the Photoshop mockup before I started was great, because now I had clear instructions what to cut apart and where, and I could just confidently go ahead and work through the steps quickly. So I separated the hand that holds the chalice, and I also cut off the sword below the hilt. The chest part is really well sculpted, with all the intricate muscle design, but there was no great way to save it while keeping the section below that I wanted to use intact. So I cut through it and then trimmed away the extra parts I didn't need. I also started to hollow out the Knight Azuro's chest part so I could slide it on top of the lower body and reposition them any way I want. I also got rid of the giant halo thing on his back and carved a collar that would look more like something a Space Marine armor would have. And it turns out I wouldn't have to pay too much attention because the jump pack would cover a lot of the area back there and hide any ugly features. I got rid of the scrolls on the backpack that were attached to it, and I also had to trim down a few extra bits so I would have smooth surfaces the wings could attach to later. Then I glued it all together and evaluated my options. For a second I thought I could just use the Space Marine backside, but then decided against it and only used the butt protectors and cut off everything above the belt. Keeping some of these more typical elements would allow me to retain the general Space Marine aesthetic. Luckily, a lot of this came together right away, and the sci-fi and fantasy parts ended up fitting without too much hassle, and I just had to cut away the correct parts. The vial would not be visible in the new configuration, so I cut it off and kept it for later, as I had an idea how to still put it on the Mini in a credible way. At this point I cleaned up the cuts I made at the weapon and the new handle and pinned them together as I got closer to finalizing the pose. As a little side quest, I also quickly got rid of all the Stormcast heraldry and iconography. I decided against using any of the Knight Azuro's cloth parts, and it hurt a bit to cut it down, but I wanted to use the hip protectors and gradually hacked away until they were individual elements I could later just glue on to my kit bash. The more gothic chestplate was great for my plans, but I had to Space Marinify it up a little bit, so I cut down the shoulder area until I could fit the Sanguinor shoulder guards on. And I sculpted some flat armor over the straps that were holding the armor together, which would portray the sci-fi setting. I popped this pauldron on by using a ball of epoxy putty, so I had some wiggle room for repositioning. The other side fit a bit better naturally after separating the braces part from the original shoulder armor. And in hindsight, I also should have kept the chainmail on the other side, as it turned out to be a pretty good fit on the right, even with the new shoulder guard attached. Then it was time to put together the major parts of the body. So I applied some glue and fiddled around a bit with the pose until I was happy, and then let it cure. I really wanted to find that balance where his chest would come forward and up a bit while he's proudly raising the chalice, or the lantern, whichever I would end up using. The only thing left to do was to join the parts together on the back with some epoxy clay. Mounting the wings was going to be really straightforward. I kinda already knew that from my Sanguinor guard, scraping these round parts of the jump pack flat and then cutting the wings down to where only the hinges were visible would produce exactly the look I wanted. And it was really satisfying being able to just go ahead and glue the backpack to the body at this point. I decided that 2 hip protectors would probably be overkill and make the new model look too bulky. But I knew I wanted the vial in there regardless, so I cut down the one with the chain further and glued the vial on. The end of the chain was the perfect part to attach it to. And yeah, it's probably a plastic bottle at this point because that would just swing and clash against solid armor all the time. But hey, so putting it all together was really satisfying because all the planning just paid off at this point. The only thing I still wasn't sure about was whether to keep the chalice or the lantern. Both were an amazing fit, and this was a really hard decision. The chalice gave it a more upwards momentum, and the lantern made it look more like he was descending from up high. It's really funny how a small detail like that can change so much. And again, I really think both would have looked awesome and would have totally worked. I just had to eventually decide. And I went with the lantern. But it wouldn't be a lantern ultimately, and I think my solution solves the problem really perfectly. But more on that when we start the paint job. Which one would you have picked? Have I made a mistake? Let me know in the comments. The only thing left to do was to build a base, and I just wanted to keep the pillars and all the other elements that came with the Knight Azeroth. I just wanted to position them a bit different. Also, they had to fit the much smaller base of the Sanguinor. So I cut down most of them with my sprue cutters and a knife. I cut myself really good for the first time in like 10 years. But you know, it serves me right. There's way too much pressure on that knife. Then I slapped some mini-put on the base to build bulk, used it to hold together the individual parts, and positioned them until I was happy with the directions of the pillars. Then I filled the rubble and eventually added some texture paste to the in-between areas. Because the wire attached to the chain was a little bit fragile, I popped that on after I glued the mini to the base, and that was the conversion done. I primed everything black because I knew I wanted to do this in gold metallics to fit my Sanguinor guard. And I immediately masked off the sword because I needed it to stay black. I used a mix of polished gold and hoplet gold as a base color, and I don't know what it is that makes this mix work so well, but to me it's just the perfect combination of a rich warm gold color and a really reflective finish. That's just the ideal base color to work off of. But before continuing with the gold, I gave all the elements that were not supposed to be gold a layer of black again. I wanted to add a quick, deep shade, especially in the recesses, and nothing beats the speed and effectiveness of an oil wash. Here I'm mixing Starship Filth from Abteilung with some pure black by Winsor & Newton. Using just the pure black would be too stark for my taste, and the Starship Filth makes it more muted. As you can see, I'm just letting the mix run into the recesses, and usually I would add some gloss varnish before this step, but my surfaces were pretty smooth on their own, and proof of that is that we don't get a lot of grain in the areas I accidentally touch with the wash, and it mostly sticking to the recesses. After this first layer that mostly focuses on the recesses, I'm giving all surfaces a bit of a more general wash to define the more detailed features, like the top of the wings, that has all these sharp angles, where additional contrast will just look really great. After some cleanup of the surfaces I didn't want stained, I left everything to cure overnight and then came back to it after about 12 hours with a coat of matte varnish to seal the oil paint. Again, because all of these layers are rather thin, I can be sure that this is enough time for the oil paint to cure. The result is a really neat gold base color, but it's also a bit flat, so we need to add more richness and color to it. I'm doing this by mixing Imperial Fist contrast paint with a burnt Sienna ink, and you can see how just adding one layer adds more saturation and warmth, which makes for a much more interesting gold. This mix still has the properties of contrast paint, so it dries rather smooth, and I don't have to babysit it a lot. But I will try to actively push the pigments into areas I want darker and wipe off pools from higher up areas I want brighter. After 2 or 3 of these layers, depending how dark and intense I want the areas, I switched to highlighting. And I used Tainted Gold for that, gradually building brighter spots that also end up being a lot more reflective, which adds additional contrast against the more matte areas where the wash is still visible. I added a second highlight using a 50-50 mix of Tainted Gold and bright Aluminium, especially to the edges and areas I wanted the brightest, and then used pure white Aluminium to highlight the iron halo, basically going directly over the still mostly black, slightly gold stained by some overspray surfaces. I quickly treated the purity seals to a desaturated brown base coat, adding more and more beige to highlight the raised parts, dragging the brush in lines perpendicular to the length of the parchment, which adds some additional structure that's also credible. So through a mix of stacking layers and using transparent layers going up to almost white, I built an initial light sketch and then followed that up by a thin wash mixed from burnt umber and Parasite Brown, which not only smooths out the transitions but also adds some color depth. While the pure and pristine approach Games Workshop uses for the original Sanguinor wings has its own charm, I usually prefer more banged up and aged looks. So I just layered up medium sea gray over black, defining the edges and building the bulk of a highlight in the middle, and then fading out the gradients by just dabbing on the brush, drawing some lines and generally just building structure. Gradually mixing in more white and just having fun repeating the steps, each time covering less area. This fast and loose approach needed a little cleanup, so I dragged my brush across the recesses with a mix of black and burnt umber ink. So this is one of the things I love the most when painting miniatures. Getting lost in a bit of detailing, just grabbing the magnifying glasses and a pointy brush and freehanding some symbols and scribbling on lines of text that is too small to read. And for this scribbling, I usually mix an off black, so to speak, meaning I make sure that I don't use pure black, but instead add some gray and some brown, because using black just looks really out of place. Probably because it's looking too pristine and there's too much contrast against the more worn appearance of the parchment. And that doesn't look credible. And then I just relax and scribble away. I knew I wanted to do the pauldrons in red, but didn't want to go for the classic red base coat, highlight and shading. So instead I used red ink to layer on a few thin coats, leaving more gold to shine through in the areas we would naturally highlight. That would leave these areas brighter and more reflective, because some of the gold is going to shine through. And the good thing is, with the inks being transparent, the black shading also stays visible. Remember when I said I think I found a proper solution for the chalice or lantern dilemma? What I did was treat the lantern like a closed vessel that is holding blood. Because an open cup always felt weird to me. You would just spill it everywhere in combat. And I think this actually feels a little closer to how the Red Grail is described in the lore, holding the blood of Sanguiniors and glowing from within. So over a black base coat, I started to define the upper line of the liquid inside, taking into consideration how the vessel was tilted. And then I feathered this out towards the bottom and then glazed over the transition with red ink. And 2 layers was enough to do the trick. Then I added back some white at the top and glazed over 2 layers of fluorescent red, and I think that makes for a cool glowing effect. Now, of course, I had to sell that this is some transparent material retaining the blood, because otherwise you would not be seeing it. So I painted some reflections on, starting with a medium gray at the top of the still black area, and fading it out and dragging a line down into the red, followed by a highlight with white, covering less area. I also tried to make the glow effect a bit more intense by having some glow reflect off of the adjacent areas. For some of these elements I was using this Pyrrole Red ink, which is marked as transparent, but actually has some amazing coverage, while being intense at the same time. Even over black. I'd take it. But whenever I wanted that extra intensity, I put a layer of white down before I applied the ink. And I tried to make the gemstones a bit more intriguing by doing the same thing, just applying a layer of Flourescent Orange as a last layer. Now at that point I wasn't quite finished, but I wanted to finish up the base before I tackled the power sword. So I built up a desaturated turquoise on the stones and then slapped the red-brown down on the structured paste, dragging it up into the turquoise stone. Then I added some highlights to both and proceeded to fill the crevices with pigment for that dusty and dry look, wiping away anything extra from the raised areas with a damp brush. The reason I left the sword for last was that it took a bit of planning to get all the gradients done that I wanted on there. As always, I started from black and blocked off one of the edges with masking tape I knew I wanted a glow around the connector of the energy source and carefully sprayed some halo around it with white. Then I gradually built all the gradients I wanted on the rest of the sword, always making sure to mask off the areas I already treated. Then I started building the red glow with red ink, and after that I went back in with white to set up the hot glow that I ultimately built with orange fluo. I then covered the rest of the sword with Aethermatic blue and 1 drop of Aquatic Torquoise mixed in for a bit more intensity. And on top of that, I brought back a highlight with some pure white again, covering less area than before, and then finishing everything out with some edge highlights. I also toned down that energy connector by adding a dark red and then more and more black, just so the glow would be even more intense around it. This was a blast to do, and I really like the end result, but I'm painfully aware that this is an expensive upgrade. I find it so curious to see how well these kits fit together and how they were released in such a close succession. It's almost like they want you to realize that Age of Sigmar is actually the better Warhammer 40k right now and spend a little extra on these upgrades. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. You are the reason I can continue these kit bashes and share them with everyone else. If you enjoy the videos and want to support more of them while also showing up in the credits, why not consider joining up through the link in the description? Even the smallest contribution goes such a long way. For now, keep pushing that pigment, and I'll see you in the next one.